Welcome to the 17th deep dive of our show, exploring Simone de Beauvoir's groundbreaking work, The Second Sex, and really digging into its lasting impact on feminist thought.
It's great to be back. It's dense material, but always fascinating to revisit.
Absolutely. So for this session, we're really going to unpack insights from a key section of the book. We want to zero in on Beauvoir's analysis of how a girl becomes a woman, drawing on the source material you shared, particularly focusing on the ideas relevant to, I think it was pages 470 to 500, but also placing that in the broader context she builds.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, even when she's discussing these very personal experiences, the philosopher is always present. Her background in existentialism, her engagement with thinkers like Hegel, Marx, Sartre, even Levi-Strauss, it all shapes her analysis. You can see that framework underneath everything.
That's what makes it so compelling, isn't it? That mix of deep personal experience and rigorous philosophical thinking. And her core thesis, well, it's there right from the beginning.
Right. She argues that male supremacy isn't just, how things happen to turn out. It's rooted way back in primitive times, connected to man's relationship with tools. He starts to escape the kind of immediate destiny of the species, making life and activity a project.
Building things, shaping the world.
Whereas woman, through the biological reality of motherhood, remains, in Beauvoir's view, sort of riveted to her body, closer to that immediate life cycle.
And humanity tends to value the reasons for living the projects, the transcendence, more than just life itself.
Which leads man to position himself as the master, the one who creates values, the one who subjugates nature. And as part of that, woman.
He becomes the standard, the norm, the same.
And she becomes defined in relation to him as the deviation, the other.
And Beauvoir doesn't just leave it as an abstract idea. She traces how this dynamic gets built, historically, socially.
And then how it's lived psychologically by individual women. Which brings us right to what we want to unpack today, that process of becoming woman.
Starting from those formative years.
Yeah, it's quite an exploration. She points out how really early on, things like the games girls are given, the stories they hear, the dreams they're encouraged to have, it all subtly steers them towards passivity.
But there's this internal conflict, right? Beauvoir suggests there's this, fundamental human sense that accepting this passive role feels like giving something up, a kind of resignation, even a self-mutilation. It feels wrong.
Absolutely. Deep down, the girl, as a human being, desires activity, autonomy, just like her brothers might. And for young children, freedom isn't really a burden yet, is it? They feel relatively safe, looked after.
But the relationship with the mother becomes this really crucial, often difficult space.
Beauvoir sees that maternal world as potentially narrow, even stultifying. The girl often wants to escape the mother's authority, which feels very constant, very intimate, focused on routine in a way boys might not experience quite as intensely.
And she doesn't just talk about normal mothers either, does she? She mentions pathological cases.
Right, where a mother might unconsciously use the child to sort of affirm her own precarious sense of being a subject. But even with a perfectly fine mother, Beauvoir sees rebellion as, well, almost a necessary step for the girl.
Then, as adolescence hits, Beauvoir really highlights the physical fears and the confusing emergence of sexuality. She mentions this, I found this striking, this frequent desire among girls for operations like appendectomies.
Yeah, and her interpretation is key. She doesn't see it just as, wanting an operation. She reads it symbolically as tied to deeper fear of penetration, fear of pregnancy, fear of childbirth itself. The womb becomes this locus of, obscure dangers.
Almost a wish that a surgeon could just remove the threat.
Sort of, yeah. And then the arrival of menstruation, Beauvoir presents that as this unavoidable biological marker confirming her perceived destiny.
Which contrasts with what she says about earlier eroticism.
Right. She talks about early, often solitary clitoral pleasure as being quite autonomous, innocent even, not yet freighted with the meaning of being a woman. Even early encounters with boys might just stem from curiosity.
But then adolescence brings this real emotional turmoil. The whole body becomes potentially erogenous. There's this search for excitement, maybe in rough play, or just that weird feeling after dancing.
And Beauvoir is quite stark about the frequency of unwanted or ambiguous experiences. Things like indiscreet touches from family friends, relatives, even authority figures, professors, doctors, priests. She insists these are common occurrences.
Which must contribute to this landscape she describes of terror and disgust, obsessive rape fantasies, checking the room at night, men themselves becoming sources of fear.
And that disgust can extend even to, say, her father. Beauvoir notes physical revulsion, his smell, the bathroom as being quite frequent, particularly if there's underlying tension already.
She mentions a recurring dream, too, doesn't she, about being raped in front of an older woman who consents?
Yes, a disturbing image. Beauvoir interprets it symbolically, suggesting it represents the girl seeking, on some level, her mother's permission for her own confusing, forbidden desires.
And what makes this whole period so difficult, according to Beauvoir, is the hypocrisy forced upon girls.
Exactly. They're constantly told about purity and innocence while they're grappling with these complex, often unsettling discoveries about sex and life.
So they have to hide things, hide thoughts, hide desires, which leads to this internal conflict, this self-defiance. Beauvoir says it can even make them look physically unwell.
And she argues that overcoming these deep-seated inhibitions later is incredibly hard. The girl feels burdened by these, like, unspeakable faults. And this is crucial. She transforms not just in shame, but in remorse for feeling that shame.
Remorse for feeling shame, that's powerful. It's like blaming yourself for the effects of the system you're caught in.
Precisely. It's what she calls the awkward age, this really painful time. And a big factor she points to is the girl's perceived lack of physical power.
She hasn't experienced force in her own body the way boys often do through play or fighting.
Right. And Beauvoir argues this translates into a kind of general timidity, a reluctance to be enterprising, to really challenge things, to invent her own world.
So she becomes conditioned towards docility, resignation, accepting the place society offers her, accepting the rules as just how things are.
Contrast that with the adolescent boy. For him, adolescence often signals growing independence, freedom, social value, manly prestige. The world seems to open up. He's allowed, even encouraged, to question things, maybe even revolt.
But for the girl, Beauvoir frames adolescence as a crisis, a fundamental split between her potential as a human being, a subject, and the limiting feminine vocation being pushed on her.
It's this really tough, decisive moment, torn between wanting to act, to be free, and the pressure both internal through her developing eroticism and external from society to become this passive, desired object.
The core dilemma. How do you give up yourself to become this inessential other?
And that constant wavering, that uncertainty between desire and disgust, hope and fear, Beauvoir describes it as leaving this bitter taste of unripe fruit.
And how do girls react to this dilemma? Beauvoir suggests it varies.
It does, often depending on their earlier experiences. For instance, narcissism, maybe developed earlier, can morph into a kind of masochism.
The dream of being the victim, the martyr, like Griselda.
Yeah, where the self is defined entirely by and for others. And Beauvoir makes this really sharp point. Sometimes annihilating yourself before someone else can be this perverse, almost arrogant way of demanding to be seen, to have your sacrifice acknowledged.
And many, she says, try to cope by seeking out a superior man.
Right. Someone older, established, powerful, possessing authority, prestige, money, fame, an absolute subject whose attention they hope will grant them significance, make them feel indispensable.
So they might look down on ordinary guys, try to avoid dealing with their own messy sexuality.
And cling to this idealized image of themselves as the perfect, perhaps suffering partner, like the character Marie Lahardouin she mentions.
But there's a catch-22 there, isn't there? If the fascinating man actually shows real feelings.
He becomes ordinary, loses his mystique. She might even blame him for, dragging her down. And if she does give in sexually, but feels nothing, just sees him as a brutal animal, Beauvoir notes, citing psychotherapists like Steckel, the disillusionment can be devastating, even leading to thoughts of suicide.
This kind of leads to a taste for the impossible, maybe. Pursuing unavailable men.
Potentially. Men courting a friend, married men, classic Don Juans. There might be this fantasy of reforming him, but Beauvoir implies there's often an underlying, perhaps unconscious knowledge that it's doomed. This can trap some women, making them unable to form real reciprocal relationships, always chasing an ideal.
But it's not all negative pathways, is it? Beauvoir sees potential in that openness girls often have.
Definitely. It can foster positive qualities, receptivity, generosity, attentiveness. She uses heroines from Rosamund Lehman's novels as examples, women whose love feels like a genuine gift, not just about their own needs.
Women who might have their own lives, their own projects, but still maintain this kind of tender expectation towards others and the world.
Yes, because they're oriented towards the other, Beauvoir suggests they can perceive this marvelous dimension in everything, loving their family, their home, nature, all at once. They find a way to charm through yielding, patience, sweetness, acceptance, even silent suffering.
Like that Colette quote she uses about getting ready, feeling her capacities, inviting the world's gaze.
Uh-huh.
It's an act of kind of welcoming.
hmm Then she also discusses what she calls pseudo-erotic experiences.
Right, girls who might have many encounters, maybe to numb anxiety or obsessions.
But the acts themselves are described as, like, theoretical, unreal,
Hmm.
lacking real danger or real pleasure. The arousal is just superficial.
These are the deflowered virgins who, deep down, are still basically young girls.
Yeah, they might even resist a genuinely sensual man still caught in that awkward age mentality, seeing sex as just a game, holding on to those adolescent phobias and disgusts.
Which can lead to issues later, like semi-frigidity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because genuine sexual maturity, for Beauvoir, requires experiencing real arousal and pleasure, not just performing the actions.
So underlying all this, Beauvoir argues the girl is taught from day one to see herself as an object. Her upbringing encourages her to treat her body as something alienable, separate from her true self.
And puberty reinforces this. Her body becomes not just a source of confusing feelings, but something passive, something for others to desire, a thing to be adorned, touched, looked at.
Even in private, solitary moments, Beauvoir suggests a split can happen. The woman becomes both the observing male subject and the observed female object. She uses examples like Dalbiez's patient Irene or Marie Bashkirtseff wishing someone could see her body's beauty.
And this internalizing of the male gaze, this difficulty in simply being for herself, makes it incredibly hard to achieve that positive sense of self, that positive otherness in the existential sense, defining oneself through engagement with the world, not just through being seen.
So this whole journey through the formative years, as Beauvoir details it, particularly in those pages we mentioned, it really lays the groundwork, doesn't it? It shows how deeply that societal construction of woman as other gets imprinted psychologically.
Absolutely. It sets the stage for all the challenges and complexities she explores in women's lives beyond adolescence.
Which we see playing out in various ways, like how society continues to push the idea of woman as an erotic object. Fashion, for example.
Right. Beauvoir sees fashion not just as clothes, but as something that actively hinders women's ability to act in the world. Think impractical shoes, restrictive clothing. It makes the body something to be displayed rather than an instrument for her own projects.
It might be fun for a little girl playing dress up.
Sure, but then comes that awkward age where her desire for autonomy clashes with it. Later, if she accepts this role of being a sex object, she might enjoy adornment, maybe finding a connection with nature through it, but it's still largely within that framework of being looked at.
She also tackles prostitution very directly.
Very. She completely dismisses any notion of it being about inherent flaws in women. She insists most prostitutes are normal, even intelligent.
For her, it's fundamentally about supply and demand. Masculine demand creates the market.
And the supply comes from dire economic circumstances, lack of work, poverty, terrible wages. She sees it not as proof of female vice, but as a harsh critique of a society where selling your body might be the best or at least bad option available.
Then there's her portrayal of midlife. Around age 50, it sounds quite bleak.
It can be. She describes women potentially finding a kind of freedom as their traditional duties diminish, children grown, maybe menopause. But it's often a hollow freedom. Freedom from duties, but freedom for what?
Because society hasn't prepared her for anything else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Patriarchal society, in her view, made her function servile. So she escapes that servitude only when she's no longer seen as productive in those specific ways. Meanwhile, men are often reaching the peak of their careers. She's facing a kind of forced retirement. Taught devotion her whole life, suddenly no one seems to need her.
That phrase, "no one needs me," it sounds like a cry of despair.
It is. She feels useless, unjustified. And Beauvoir suggests this despair can lead to erratic or self-destructive behavior.
Religion is another area she examines critically.
Very critically. She sees it as being offered to women, much like she says it's offered to the people as a kind of compensation, a mirage of transcendence for those largely confined to immanence, to the everyday, the bodily.
And it benefits men in her analysis.
Immensely. God, as presented by patriarchal religions, conveniently endorses the social codes and confirms male authority over women. The fear of God becomes a tool to discourage rebellion.
There's an assumption of credulity on the part of women.
Yes, that they'll just accept this masculine universe where God isn't much different from the local government official. But she also acknowledges it fills a real need. In modern times, it's less about direct coercion and more about mystification. By presenting societal inequalities as natural or divinely ordained, It obscures the fact that they are constructed. It allows women to feel equal in God's eyes, which helps manage feelings of inferiority without actually challenging the system.
So the temptation to revolt is kind of diffused.
Right. You dedicate your earthly life, your immanence, to God, telling yourself that real judgment happens later, earthly success is unimportant, and true equality exists beyond society.
And she sees this playing out differently for girls versus boys.
Yeah, she notes girls often show greater religious fervor. Why? Because God's gaze for a boy might feel humbling, a check on his worldly power, a symbolic castration, she calls it.
Huh.
But for the girl, that same gaze can feel like salvation. It makes her a sister of angels, cancels out the privilege associated with masculinity. So sincere faith genuinely helps her cope with feeling secondary.
Though she does mention exceptions, powerful female saints.
Like Bridget, Catherine of Siena, Joan of Arc, Teresa of Avila. Women who exerted considerable influence, even directing powerful men. But she concludes that the church as an institution ultimately maintains male guardianship.
What about women in the arts? Actresses, dancers, singers?
She sees potential there. Their careers often align with traditional femininity, but offer real independence, a way out from under direct male control. Their work gives their life meaning.
And professional success boosts their sexual value, similar to how it works for men.
Right. So they might feel less torn than other women. The focus on beauty and charm becomes part of the job, justifying that narcissism rather than creating conflict. There's satisfaction in displaying what she is. And a great actress, Beauvoir concedes, can transcend this to become a true artist. But, she adds, there are still traps.
And women writers, she seems more critical there.
She sees them as insurgents, often using their writing to critique society. She mentions George Eliot. But she also quotes Virginia Woolf's idea.
That they used up so much energy just fighting societal constraints.
Exactly. Fighting to get published, to be taken seriously. That they arrived out of breath at the starting line where male writers began, often lacking that easy confidence, that breadth of worldly experience. She contrasts major works Middlemarch versus War and Peace, Wuthering Heights versus the Brothers Karamazov, suggesting a resulting difference in scope or depth.
Even though things are easier now, she still felt women writers were somewhat confined by femininity.
Yes. Achieving clarity, lucidity is a huge victory, but she felt they often stopped short of digging into the deeper ambiguities of reality. The traditional woman is caught in mystification. The liberated woman writer denounces it, maybe uses cynicism as a shield.
But perhaps remains too focused on the cause.
That's her suggestion. Too invested in pulling back veils to disinterestedly explore the enigma underneath. They expose illusions but maybe hesitate at the threshold of reality's complex, messy truth. She finds their autobiographies often sincere but perhaps not deeply penetrating, focused on seeing clearly rather than exploring shadows.
Finally, she addresses love, particularly the danger of complete devotion.
Yes, putting your entire self, your entire existence, into another person's hands. She portrays this as incredibly risky.
Like moving to a new country for someone, only to be potentially kicked out.
That's the analogy. You give up your own life, your friends, your values. If the relationship ends, you have nothing left. No foundation to rebuild on.
For a woman who has devoted years, it's not just sadness, it's a crushing catastrophe. She becomes a dethroned queen.
And Beauvoir questions if she ever truly ruled a real kingdom anyway. If she's young, maybe she can recover, perhaps becoming more guarded next time, or maybe the experience crushes her even more.
The crucial point being
That this kind of failure is only potentially productive if the woman already had a strong, autonomous sense of self before the relationship. She uses Heloise finding purpose in running an abbey, or Colette finding salvation in her writing as examples. Without that independent core, total devotion is almost self-destructive.
So for Beauvoir, authentic love, real liberation, has to be built on
Reciprocal recognition of two freedoms, two independent individuals choosing to be together.
marriage or partnership shouldn't be about escaping yourself, or annexing someone else, or just fixing loneliness.
No, it should combine two autonomous lives. The couple isn't a closed-off unit. Individuals need to stay connected to society. It's about creating connections based on generosity and mutual respect for each other's freedom. And she does believe such balanced couples, though maybe rare, can exist.
So to kind of synthesize this, Beauvoir's whole argument is that woman's situation isn't natural, it's not inevitable. It's the outcome of these long historical and social forces that have constructed her as the other.
And that deep dive into the formative years, the section relevant to pages 470 to 500 especially, shows just how profoundly this construction shapes a girl's psychology, that intense conflict between wanting to be a subject and being pressured into becoming an object.
And we see the echoes of that formation in the challenges women face later in work, in love, and simply trying to realize themselves as full human beings.
Ultimately, her vision is one of liberation through achieving authentic selfhood, built on mutual recognition of freedom between individuals, moving beyond those historical constraints.
Which leaves us with a final thought, something for you, our listeners, to mull over. Beauvoir suggests that a girl's transformation into woman happens not just in shame, but in remorse for suffering that shame. So, what does this core experience, this internalized conflict and feeling at fault for your own conditioned responses reveal about the really deep psychological hurdles women might face in truly embracing the kind of autonomous existence and reciprocal freedom that Beauvoir envisions?